Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's stakeholder call to discuss the draft compliance filing language for the Extended Day-Ahead Market and Day-Ahead Market Enhancements Initiative. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. I'm also joined on the line by John Anders, as well as Andrew Ulmer and David Zlotlow from Legal. And then we have Milos Bosniak from Policy on the line as well. So before we get started, I just want to make you all aware that the draft compliance filing language was posted yesterday to both the EDM and DAME initiative web pages. You can get those pages by going to CAISO.com. Then on the main page, you'll see the Stay Informed tab. If you go under that Stay Informed tab and click Policy Initiatives, that will take you out to our main initiative landing page. And then both the EDM and DAME pages are accessible from that main landing page. This call is being recorded. The recording is for informational and convenience purposes only, so any related transcription should not be recorded without the ISO's permission. And if you need technical assistance at any point during the meeting, you can send a chat to our event producer. And then we will be pausing for questions throughout the call today, so if you connected to audio through your computer or use the Call Me option in WebEx, you can raise your hand by selecting the Raise Hand icon, which is located just at the bottom of your screen. If you dialed in separately to the conference, then you'll need to press #2 to raise your hand. And then just a reminder to everyone who's joining us today to please remember to state your name and affiliation before making your comment or asking your question. And then you can also send your question through the chat to me directly. Again, my name is Isabella Nicosia, or you can send it to all panelists. The agenda for today, in just a moment here, I'll hand things over to John Anders for some introductory remarks. And then we'll hand things back to Andrew Ulmer and David Zlotlow to walk us through the draft compliance filing language, and then leave some time at the end to go over next steps, and John Anders will cover those for us. So with that, I will hand things over to John.
Thanks, Isabella. I guess, I wanted to express appreciation to everyone for their, efforts throughout the EDAM and DAME process leading up to and through, the December 20 order. And we're here today to talk about our compliance filing with that order. But I have to say, we're certainly thankful for all the support we received. I think it's reflected in the order itself. And as far as our conversation here today, it's really sort of the first sort of formal activity we're undertaking following that order. So we wanted to reach out and engage with you all today to cover some of the key elements of our compliance filing. In total, the compliance directives are fairly narrow, fairly limited. They're really reflected in paragraphs 518 to 520 of the order and discussed in more detail elsewhere throughout the order. But what we're going to talk about with you today are really just two of the elements of the compliance directives, and that's primarily because most of everything else, in fact, all of everything else, is really cleanup, clarification, correction, those kinds of ministerial sorts of things. But we did want to take the time to go through the tariff language that we will be submitting on the market power mitigation requirements to include the additional details in the tariff around the procedures that we have employed in the EIM and the EDAM for market power mitigation. And then we'll go into the deployment factor considerations associated with the day-ahead market and the imbalance reserve product. So that's really the focus of our discussion today. As far as other elements of the proposal, I suppose the one that has probably got the most interest would be the transmission revenue recovery mechanism, or also known as the EDAM access charge. And in that context, the direction from the Commission was a rejection of our proposal, a rejection without prejudice. So clearly we have the opportunity to resubmit something, but the considerations of what may be resubmitted to the Commission is not part of the compliance filing today, our discussions today, or our submittal here in a few weeks. Really all we're going to do on compliance is remove the tariff language that was submitted in our proposal. So that's really section 33.26. We'll probably remove all that and replace it with a not used placeholder in our tariff. There's also one small section in 33.4 in the onboarding sections around gathering information associated with the revenue recovery mechanism, and that will be also removed. So there will be no transmission revenue recovery mechanism for EDAM in the tariff at this time. Any follow-up on that will come in a later submission, and we're still evaluating all of our options on that score. Clearly, it was rejected without prejudice. So we do have an opportunity to revisit that and consider what might be appropriate for EDAM as far as a transmission revenue recovery mechanism. I guess before I turn it over to Andrew to cover the market power mitigation, I guess I'll pause for a moment here, see if there are any questions about what we're going to discuss today, what's included in the discussions, and maybe what's not included in the discussion. All right, well, everybody's welcome to ask questions at any time and follow up. We can catch back up if something comes up at the end with the next steps. But for now, I'll turn it over to Andrew, and he can go over the market power mitigation draft tariff language.
Hi, good morning. My name is Andrew Ulmer, and as John mentioned, I'm hoping to start this discussion with the tariff language that we're going to propose to extend BAA level market power mitigation that we currently apply in the Western Energy Imbalance Market to the extended day-ahead market. So we're proposing to submit this language, as John mentioned, in our compliance filing, consistent with the direction that the Commission included in its order to submit clarifying language on the topic. I'll just, before we talk about the structure of the tariff language, I'll just provide a quick overview. And in a nutshell, what we're doing is proposing language to extend BA level mitigation that occurs in real time today as part of the EIM, as I mentioned, to the integrated forward market and to the residual unit commitment for BAs that join the extended day-ahead market. So it's essentially moving what we're doing in real time into the day-ahead time frame. But as you'll recall, many of you, upon implementation of the extended day-ahead market, we will have balancing authority level power balance constraints. Essentially, each balancing authority will have its own marginal energy cost. And for market power mitigation purposes in the EDAM BAs, what we're proposing is that the marginal energy cost within the ISOs, the California ISOs balancing authority, will reflect a competitive component of LMP. And what that means effectively for market power mitigation purposes is when an EDAM or an EIM BA's marginal energy cost is greater in the positive direction than the ISO BA's marginal energy cost, then we will test, then the process will test the EDAM or EIM balancing authority for competitiveness pursuant to our market power mitigation procedures. So that's a little bit of background. We talk about the structure of the language. It shows up in three sections. The first is section 29.39 that is the language we use for the Western Energy Imbalance Market. So this would be some additional language that to reflect that concept I just mentioned with respect to the marginal energy cost of an EIM or an EDAM BAs being higher than the ISO's BA's marginal energy cost in the real-time market. And then we've got subsequent conforming changes throughout this section to clarify that it will apply not just to an EIM balancing authority, but also to an EDAM balancing authority when that BA is in the real time. And that is essentially the structure of Section 2939. I think most of the language is relatively self-explanatory. The next section we're amending is Section 33.3121, and what we've done is tried to promote parallel language for purposes of describing the market power mitigation procedures in the integrated forward market in that section. And then parallel language in Section 33.31.2.3 related to market power mitigation for the residual unit commitment for EDAM BAs. So the structure of the language is fairly consistent across those two sections. And that, you know, at a high level is what we're proposing on compliance. I would say that this language does remain, you know, subject to review internally. It may change slightly just to ensure clarity. I think I've already identified maybe a missing word where we should probably reference market power mitigation process as opposed to just market power mitigation. But other than that, I think it's in relatively final form. And I would like to provide a shout out and thanks to our market monitoring unit for its review of the tariff that we filed and its comments in the docket. I think that those helped bring this issue to the surface, and you know, hopefully we'll have a better and clearer tariff once we get this compliance filing in. So that I'll stop and see if there are any questions or comments. And you know, obviously, I think Isabella mentioned, submit those to the chat window. We can capture them or follow up with her afterwards. But happy to try to field any questions now.
Again, you can raise your hand by selecting the raise hand icon, which is located at the bottom of your screen. Or if you called in separately, you can raise your hand by pressing #2. I'm not seeing any questions.
Okay, and I know we have a couple of our subject matter experts on the line. If there's any amplification, James or others, if you want to amplify, please feel free. Otherwise, I will hand the baton to David.
David, you may be.
Well,
oh,
nope,
now we
I
can hear you.
should be unmuted now. Okay. Isabella, can you confirm I'm unmuted now? You hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Good morning.
Okay, perfect. Yep, okay. So moving to the day-ahead market enhancement compliance language. So I guess first what we have on the screen here is the deployment factor. What you see here on the screen is the very small edit to the Appendix A definition of the term deployment factor. As we filed it initially with the Commission, we just said the deployment factor is specified in the business practice manual, and then you have the rest of the definition there. And then, so what we have here is the compliance changes to note that Section 31.30.1.6.3.1, which we'll turn to in just a moment, that has the detail that we believe would comply with first order to add more detail in the tariff on the two tunable parameters. So here, this is really just a cross-reference in the Appendix A definition of deployment factor to just note that now you would not only look to the BPM, but also look to that section 31.3161 to get the further details on what it is that the value of the deployment factor will be. So that's really just a cross-reference, but then moving to that section 31.3.161. And we'll scroll up there in just a moment here. Okay, and then give us a moment. I'll navigate there. And yeah, there we go. So you should see the full edit there on your screen on the WebEx window now. And so this section 31.3.161 was where we're talking about nodal procurement of the imbalance reserve awards. And this section captures the concept of both of the deployment factor and covering the concept that, as we said, we would want some ability to exercise judgment in terms of which transmission constraints are enforced in the deployment scenarios. And then, so as a reminder, the FERC order said that that's fine, ISO, but you need to have more detail in the tariff. You can't purely leave it as a BPM consideration. And then, so that's what you see here. This is our effort there to comply with that directive, and what you see here is sort of a synthesis of the various factors we identified in the stakeholder process. We posted a matrix of the considerations that had also been addressed and discussed, in the filing itself, in the narrative description, and then some of the other stakeholder documentation. So what you have here is, as I said, a synthesis of the various items we said would be at play in terms of how we define the deployment factor and the specific constraints. And then, so one thing I'll note here, you see first, before the large chunk of red text, you see a reference to through a methodology established in the BPM, and that's in the first sentence. That's just a small kind of, I'd say, cleanup item. So on the transmission constraints that will be enforced in the deployment factor, I think one thing we're just clarifying here before we get to the sort of substantive elements is we had never meant to post a list of specific transmission constraints in the BPM. The idea was there would be a further sort of more detailed statement of how it is we're going to identify the enforced constraints. There wasn't a specific intent to actually have a table saying, here's a list of, 20 constraint names, and those are the ones that will be enforced. So we're just clarifying here through a methodology established in the BPM. So with the BPM as to the constraints will kind of have a more detailed statement of how it is we would define the constraints. The specific names of the constraints wouldn't be listed out in the BPM. So that's one issue to note, but then moving to kind of the more detail on what it is we're going to consider in setting the deployment factor and considering the enforced constraints. So for both items, the idea is that they exist to meet a trade-off between the benefit of having the imbalance reserves as reliably deliverable as they can be, and that's traded off against the economic implications from having those deliverability requirements on procurement. And so again, the idea that we sketched out in the stakeholder process in the FERC filing is that the reason we have these tunable parameters is because, imbalance reserves are there to basically serve as a form of insurance against having net load imbalances. But, insurance, how much you pay for insurance is a factor of the harm you're trying to mitigate and the likelihood of the bad thing happening. And so there's really a constant trade-off you need to keep in mind in terms of, is the cost of this imbalance reserve product, is it justified? Are we spending an appropriate amount of money collectively through the market to mitigate the harm? And so that's what this trade-off is really high level saying. We're trading off the benefit of having those imbalance reserves reliably deliverable against, the economic implications, which is, how much is it costing? So that's the high level trade-off. Then I would say in making this trade-off, you know, here's some of the factors we're going to weigh in terms of kind of judging is the right trade-off being struck. So item 1, you see there's 6 numbered items. I'll just briefly explain which each of these are. Item 1, deliverability of energy procured from awarded imbalance reserves. So that's sort of the whole issue there in a nutshell. When we convert imbalance reserve capacity to energy, is it deliverable? So that's sort of, is it working? Are we getting what we want from the product? So that's sort of getting to the utility of the product. So that's obviously a very, very important consideration, because if we're, you know, if the product's clearing at very, very low prices, that's great. But if it's never deliverable, then it's still, you know, money that isn't really going to any good use. So that's one factor. Of course, again, all of these are weighed against each other, but that's one factor. Second factor, marginal cost of congestion for energy. So we'd also be looking at, you know, what is the impact of the imbalance reserve procurement having on energy? Because, you know, you have to reserve some of the transmission capacity in the deployment scenarios to help ensure that if converted, the award from the energy from the imbalance reserve capacity, if deployed for energy, it's deliverable. So you're holding back some transmission for, you know, for the imbalance reserves. That's going to have an impact on the energy congestion component. So what is that impact? How big of an impact is it? The second factor. Third factor is looking at the direct, you know, direct procurement costs of the imbalance reserve product itself. So item 2 is about what impact does the imbalance reserves have on energy congestion. Then 3 is what's the direct cost of procuring the imbalance reserve product itself. Item 4, performance of the IFM optimization. We had noted this as a consideration as you add the imbalance reserve deployment scenarios into the IFM. That's creating a more complex problem for the IFM to solve. You know, we believe that, you know, it can handle it. That's, you know, it will still be able to get quality solutions in a timely way, you know, consistent with the current deadlines of opening the day-ahead market closing the market at 10 a.m., posting results at 1 p.m. But if we see over time that, you know, that 1 p.m. deadline is really getting impacted, we're getting close, we're moving past it consistently, you know, one issue as well, maybe move the deadline. But of course, you know, first thing is, are we adding too much complexity or sort of too many things to solve at once for the IFM? How is that being impacted? You know, maybe you move back to time, or you look at ways to make the optimization less intense so that it can still solve in the right time. So that's item 4. Item 5, that is sort of getting at the point of the imbalance reserves, which we talked about at length in the FERC process about how, you know, today the need that imbalance reserve products is meant to serve, that need is being addressed today largely through out-of-market operator actions. And so one thing to look at is, you know, if imbalance reserves exist, they're part of the market, and yet we still see, you know, consistent operator interventions through out-of-market actions to address net load imbalances, that would be one indication that maybe the product isn't working as well as we would have hoped. And so that might be an indication that you would tune either of the deployment factor or the enforced transmission constraints one way or the other, depending on, you know, looking at that as a indication of how well the product is working. And then the 6th item here, effect of other factors, that's just to capture that we can't know all of the factors now, but so we have to leave a little bit of a kind of catch-all category, things that we couldn't, you know, anticipate, you know, when this goes live as having a meaningful impact on the basic trade-off I talked about before. So those are the various factors we would intend to weigh in spelling out the BPM language on the actual value of the deployment factor and the sort of more detailed approach to how we're going to identify the enforced transmission constraint. Okay, So with that, that's kind of the concept of what we're looking to do to comply with the order on the tunable parameters. And I will stop there if we have questions, or can turn it back over to my colleagues.
Looks like we have a hand from Alba Sabota.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. I just really appreciate the detail there. One question I had was just, is the deployment factor, does it pertain to a constraint or a resource, or a particular transmission constraint or a particular imbalance reserve constraint, or a resource?
And none of those. It's actually it's a percentage, and I guess we'll have 1% for the up product and 1% for the down product. So there's, I guess, 2 deployment factors for that, one for the up, one for the down. But that's a percentage that's going to apply universally through the whole EDAM footprint for those who are part of the imbalance reserve procurement, and that's just the that's the percentage of the product that would be evaluated to be deliverable. That's a single percentage for the up and single percentage for the down that's applied in the optimization across the whole range of procurement. I see James Friedrich, my colleague, has his hand raised, so I'll let him chime in on this.
Hey, David. Hey, Alba. Yeah, just more specifically, what the deployment factor would do essentially is that every resource has a shift factor contribution to any individual or any transmission constraint. And what the shift factor would do is essentially multiply that shift factor contribution by the deployment factor. So for example, if a specific resource had a shift factor contribution to a transmission constraint of 0.5, for example, and the deployment factor was 0.9, then the resulting sort of shift factor matrix that would be used in the deployment scenario would say that resource has a shift factor contribution of 0.45, which is 0.9 times 0.5. So it's that's sort of functionally what's happening in the optimization problem as a result of the deployment factor.
Perfect, thank you. And just out of curiosity, does this have any implication that resources might, because of there generally is a lower bound below which resources aren't able to contribute, is it the case that a resource might contribute in the base energy constraint and not be able to contribute to imbalance reserve constraint because it goes below some level of contribution? Is that applied to imbalance reserves as well as energy?
So can I rephrase your question? I think what you're asking is that, we have a sort of a shift factor contribution threshold whereby if you have a shift factor below a certain value, we just sort of ignore the value. And you're asking if the multiplication of your shift factor takes you below that threshold, does that then mean we ignore your contribution to the deployment scenarios where otherwise we would not ignore it for the base energy case? That's your basic question?
Yes, that's the question.
So I know we talked about this internally, but to be honest, I don't remember exactly where we landed on this question. David, if you remember, please share. But if not, we can circle back.
I do have a memory, largely because the shift factor threshold change. We had a tariff change within the last 6 to 8 months on the language on the shift factor threshold, and I recall that as we were drafting this language, we had to sort of assume that the shift factor threshold language that had been pending at FERC would be approved, but there was some interaction with there. And I know we did say something about how the shift factor threshold would roll into the imbalance reserve procurement. I don't remember exactly what we said, but I do know we addressed that in one of the other tariff sections.
Okay,
I just
great.
can't
Thanks.
remember.
If you would appreciate any further feedback on that, James, or sorry, Andrew. So thank you.
Yeah, it would just be a matter of re-reviewing that tariff section, and then we can follow up with it. We can circle back on that.
Yeah, and I see we have another caller in the queue.
Hi, this is Bonnie Blair. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi.
Good morning.
Bonnie Blair. I work with the Six Cities group. You mentioned toward the beginning that that the constraints that would be enforced, obviously they're not going to be in the tariff, but they were not going to be listed in the BPM either. Are the constraints to be enforced going to be listed anywhere that's public?
So I think the concept was it would match, you know, that I think today when we have for the energy market, there's constraints that are, you know, enforced or not enforced for certain purposes. And I think we were looking to take the same approach here. And so I'll need someone else to help me. I assumed that in those existing processes, there is a some place where the actual constraints are identified after the fact on OASIS or something like that. But I'll need to ask one of my colleagues to confirm that, or we might have to take that back. Because I assume your question is, are you eventually going to know? Like, even if you don't know ahead of time, but after fact for purposes of sort of market analysis, sort of understanding how the market works, et cetera. Will there be transparency?
Or ahead of time. I mean, I don't know. I haven't thought through what the implications would be of before the fact or after the fact, but it does seem like at some point it would be appropriate to have transparency into that, maybe after the fact for analysis. And another question I have is, are the enforceable constraints something that's going to change frequently, or are they going to be relatively stable?
I believe it's meant to be relatively stable. That I don't think there's any intent to like have it be a dynamic process that's, you know, changing day by day or for different, you know, hour by hour or anything like that. I think it's meant to be pretty constant.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks. And I guess maybe if at some point you could come back on the question of whether the constraints are going to be identified anywhere, either before or after the fact. That would be helpful. Thanks.
Yep. Okay. And I guess if we could unmute Kathleen Colbert's line. See you're next in the queue.
Great, thank you. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks for going through this. And just a quick follow-up of, I think it is really important that this be transparent. I would hope, but also kind of expect, but hope that the information would be posted on OASIS so that there's transparency. I don't know that I feel strongly that that commitment to post it publicly on
the website needs to be in a tariff language, but I would like to get some affirmative commitment in some way, shape, or form that the tuning factor, whether it's effective or not and what level it is posted on OASIS would be really critical for market transparency.
Yeah, okay. I think that's something we'll need to talk about internally, but I understand the request, and I think that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for taking that back. Thank you so much.
Okay, I think it doesn't look like we have any other questions queued up. So final call for questions on the tunable parameters language. Otherwise, I can hand it back to Andrew or John.
This is Andrew. Just for the benefit of folks on the call, we did get a question in the chat about market power mitigation in the California ISO's balancing authority area, and I know we were talking about market power mitigation in the EDAM BAs. Certainly, market power mitigation procedures will still apply to the California ISO's BA, and we'll make that clear in the compliance filing that what language to look at for that. But our existing procedures in the day-ahead market and the real-time market will also apply.
All right, I'm not seeing any other questions.
Okay.
All right. Isabella, did you have a next step? There you go.
Yeah, if you want to go ahead and cover next steps.
Okay, so our directive was to submit the compliance filing within 60 days. Our intent is to do so on Friday, February 16. If that slipped, it would slip all the way till Tuesday, given the timing and the holiday. But so a week from this Friday, we are not formally seeking stakeholder comments on the draft tariff language that we will submit on compliance. However, we are open and welcome additional comments or thoughts, and we certainly gathered up what we heard here today and have a couple of follow-up items to take care of. But otherwise, we look forward to any follow-up comments and hope that this opportunity to engage with you all and to review the tariff or draft tariff language will help facilitate your understanding. And you obviously have an opportunity to comment in the compliance filing proceeding itself. But as usual, we would greatly appreciate resolving any concerns or questions you may have prior to the proceeding itself. So this is our opportunity to do so, and just let us know if there's anything else that we didn't capture here today, and we'll follow up with you about that. And with that, I don't have anything else. I see Kathleen. Is that a new hand? Let's go to Kathleen Coburn.
Yes, it is. Just real quick, Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. The compliant, so that I'm not misunderstanding what you're trying to file and kind of how you're thinking about being in compliance, I just wanted to confirm on the tunable, like the tunability, the tuning factors. I definitely see that this language explains your thinking on the deployment factor. What language should I be looking at for the determining the activation and deactivation of the constraints themselves, that piece. And
So I'll turn it back. No, I think we get your question. I'll turn it to David. He can answer it more precisely.
Yeah, so in terms of the tariff language we'd be proposing to the commission as meeting the compliance obligation, it's what you saw on the screen before.
Yeah.
So it's that minor change to Appendix A and then the other section.
Yeah, I don't see anything about the activation and deactivation in this language. I need to look at it more closely, though. Is it your understanding that it addresses that second compliance? Because the compliance directive was for both.
Right. Well, we can scroll back to the language. I can just point out how we're seeing that as needed. Yeah, Isabella, can we go back to the deployment factor and transmission constraint language?
Yeah, give me 1 second to pull it back up.
Yep. Sure. Yeah, there it is. Okay. So the language, you see in red line is talking about the methodologies, trade-offs, et cetera. But then if you look at the sentence before that has just the small edit. Yeah, and so what we had filed initially, it says we're going to optimize procurement of imbalance reserves to not, exceed so that energy dispatch and resource capacity. And then you see, sorry, my computer just froze for a second. There you go. As adjusted by the applicable deployment factor. So you see 1, 2, 3, end of the third line onto the fourth line, that parenthetical as adjusted by the applicable deployment factor. That's noting that the deployment factor will be part of the procurement. And then the sentence continues, would not result in flows exceeding transmission constraints and scheduling limits, including EDM transfer limits. And then finally, on transmission facilities identified in the BPM. And then we added through a methodology established in the BPM. So that's the reference to the enforced transmission facility. We're saying you can't exceed flows on transmission facilities. Which transmission facilities? The ones identified in a methodology defined in the BPM. So that's where both elements of the tunable parameters are covered. Does that help address that, Kathleen?
I mean, it does help me see kind of how you're trying to address that, so I really appreciate it. I will take a step back, and if I have any more feedback, I'll shoot you guys an email. Thank you.
All right, looks like we have one more caller in.
Yeah, this is Seth with DC Energy. Just a quick question. We're putting a lot of emphasis on the BPM. When's that process going to kick off?
So I will ask my colleague Milos Bozanak. I think he may be traveling, but he may be able to help answer that question. I know it's in process, but I don't have the specifics. If you have any more information at this time, Milos, that may help.
Yeah, no, thank you, John, and good morning. Yeah, we're working on implementation activities now for both DAM and EDAM, and we expect that in the later part of the year, as we're developing the software and the systems, we'll start publishing some draft business practices for stakeholder review. Keep in mind that the implementation of both DAM and EDAM will happen simultaneously in the spring of 2026. So we have a little bit of time in front of us, but we're hoping to start the business practice development in the later part of the year, iterate with stakeholders through that.
Okay, thank you. And I just emphasize that you said you'd share drafts prior to having any final language. I think that's really important. The BPM process is nice, but I would submit that really something with this sort of brevity should be taken up more in an initiative type construct rather than the BPM process, which isn't that robust, in my opinion. Thanks.
Yeah, Seth, let me just address that real quick. I think that in terms of the tunable parameters, I think there was commitment at different points that these things would be addressed starting in sort of the different market simulation processes and the other pre-go live activities. And so the sort of thinking on how to strike the right balance on the enforced constraints and the deployment factor, I think that will be happening, outside of the PRR process, the proposed revision request process, which is what the BPM revisions are. So I think it will happen in the context of a lot of the pre-deployment activities outside of just the PRR process. I think that was already sort of stated along the way. So yes, to your point, this would not be treated as just another, minor BPM change that, kind of gets handled in 5 minutes, with 10 other BPM changes. I mean, we acknowledge that these are more impactful than maybe just a regular old BPM change.
That's good to hear. Thank you for adding that additional color on it. Thanks.
Looks like one more caller. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on this point. We do remember in last year, the May, in the board meeting when the CAISO submitted the DME proposal, there seems to be a slide, and we all agree on there will be a implementation working group series to address the tunable parameter, as long as the other, along with the other, a few lingering technical issues. And that series of implementation working group, we're constantly checking with the CAISO of the timeline, and we hope to get some clarity here that you mentioned there will be a separate effort. Is that the same thing, and when it's likely to happen?
Thank you. I'll turn back to Milos and see if he has any more perspective on that. And I see James Friedrich put his hand up, so I'll go to James. James?
Hi, JK. Yes, the CAISO is still planning on an implementation working group series, and that is the sort of formal name of the process that David mentioned that would extend beyond the normal BPM processes. I don't have a timeline quite yet of when those will kick off. Preliminarily, we're thinking early next year, but the idea being that we do want to have some discussion in advance of certain milestones as it relates to software testing that and market simulation that aren't planned to happen until summer of 2025. So there is some discussion that we can have in advance of those things, but really, in reality, the bulk of the testing and the work will probably not happen until certain milestones are achieved in terms of software delivery from our vendors, so that we can do the appropriate testing and simulation on those things. So that's the best information I have as of now.
That's really helpful. Thank you, James. I want to emphasize that, for those technical issues, they're not only just the very detailed software implementations, they do embrace topics like, for example, how this parameter should be defined, what impact the formation of the LMP in the day-ahead market, as well as, some of the things we discussed before, like what we call phantom congestion, including like how the CRR, maybe the simultaneous feasibility test will be impacted. So these are actually bigger questions, shouldn't be just included in the BPM process. And we really appreciate the CAISO will formally look into these issues in a separate process. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, James, for that detail. Do we have any other next step related questions or any other questions? All right, I think, Isabella, I will turn it back to you now. And again, thank you all for participating. Really appreciate it. And again, we encourage you to reach out if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, and we'll work with you between now and the submittal, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
All right, well, if there are no further questions, I think we can close out today's call. And thank you all for joining us, and thanks to the ISO team for your presentation today. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their afternoon.